Hello, everybody. I want to welcome you to Nature Connects. Nature Connects is Massachusetts TNC's webinar series that connects you with scientists, experts, and influencers and our partners from New England and around the world. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Massachusetts State Director and your host today, Deb Markowitz. So here at the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, we're dedicated to creating a healthier world for all. We work locally and globally using innovative science and scalable, long-lasting solutions to tackle the most complex environmental challenges facing our warming planet. We know that what we do here in Massachusetts to protect nature will mean a better future for both the people and the planet. So we've got an exciting program for you today. A not so boring history of conservation, if you will. We're going to be chatting with TNC's Craig Leisher, Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for TNC's Africa region. Craig's going to give us a mixture of stories and surprising facts that cover the origins of the conservation movement, the birth and growth of major conservation NGOs, the evolution of conservation thinking, and the enduring debate on the utilization of nature versus the preservation of nature. And I have to say, I hear it from our donors and our friends all the time. Some folks are members of TNC for nature's sake, and others are friends of TNC because they know what we do helps communities and helps people. So his goal today is to inform and to entertain you, and he hopes to leave you with at least one cool conservation story or fact that you can share with others. So before we get started, though, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Craig. As I mentioned, he's the Director of Monitoring and Evaluation for TNC's Africa region, but his passion for history goes way back to high school when he aced Mr. Blackshear's U.S. history class, and he found that his brain was wired to remember historical facts. As an undergrad, he was a Russian history major, and since then he's remained well-read in the history field and works on the side as an editor of academic history books for a U.S. publisher. This talk is the culmination of many years of reading and 3 days of work over a long holiday weekend. As you think of questions for Craig, please enter them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them after the presentation. So I would just want to thank you again for joining us today, Craig, and why don't we dive in?
I love history because the past is never past. It's still present. We live with history every day. The past is the prologue to our future. Over the next 30 minutes, I want to give you a better understanding of the history of conservation. I'll cover the origins of the conservation movement, America's best idea, the birth and growth of major conservation NGOs, detail the TNC-CI split, trace the evolution of conservation thinking, and highlight the enduring debate on utilization of nature versus preservation of nature. In this talk, I will touch on steam engines, Bangor, Maine, jazz, breast cancer, and liberation theology. Onward. I live with gratitude on the ancestral land of the Lenape tribe, and this is a history of conservation, but not the history of conservation. There are multiple histories of conservation. A Lenape history of conservation, for example, would be quite different from the history I present today and equally valid. This is conservation history from a Northern NGO perspective that's tilted towards the US and Western Europe because that's what I know. I want to explicitly acknowledge that the history that I present today was largely written by people who were wealthy and white. And within the history of conservation, there are a number of inequities. This is a picture from the late 1920s of Tutuya. She was the last living person who survived the raid on the Native American communities living in Yosemite. In 1851, a band of volunteers, sanctioned by the state of California, formed the Mariposa Battalion and entered Yosemite Valley. In the middle of winter, they systematically burned Native American villages and food supplies and forced men, women, and children away from their homes. When she was a child, Tutuya witnessed the invasion, the destruction of her home in Yosemite, and the murder of her uncle by the Mariposa Battalion. Yosemite was but one of many national parks where local people were forcibly removed. The conservation of nature cannot be separated from human affairs, and a history of conservation could also be the history of inequities woven into conservation. Again, there are multiple histories of conservation, and mine is but one of them. My history of conservation starts with the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines were what powered the Industrial Revolution. The Scottish engineer James Watt created the first steam engine with rotary motion like the one you see here. To produce the steam to feed the engines, a lot of coal was burned. As the coal was burned in the Industrial Revolution, the air became thick with the smog of industry. Effluents from factories and towns poured into rivers. Google the Great Stink to read about how bad river pollution was in London 150 years ago and why death rode the River Thames, as this drawing shows. The loss of clean air and clean water made people in cities more aware of the benefits nature provides. The urban blight of the Industrial Revolution caused people to appreciate nature more. Another large-scale loss was forest cover in the eastern part of the United States. Forest cover in the eastern half of the country dropped by almost half from 1820 to 1920. In 1872, the tidal port of Bangor, Maine was the largest timber shipping port in the world. Bangor, Maine, largest timber shipping port in the world. By the 1890s, most of the forests in the northeastern United States were gone, and you could ride a train for hours in the Northeast and see only a handful of trees. The loss of forest in the eastern United States was a primary reason why people wanted to protect the forest in the western United States. So now we have air and water pollution and the large-scale loss of forest. Now let's add another factor in the rise of the conservation movement: extinctions. Passenger pigeons. In the 19th century, the passenger pigeon was the most abundant bird in North America and possibly the world. There were literally billions of passenger pigeons in North America. They flew in gargantuan flocks that could block out the sun for hours. They fed primarily on acorns and beech nuts in the forests of the East, and their sheer numbers overwhelmed most predators. But with the arrival of the railroads and the telegraph, it became possible to follow the passenger pigeons as they migrated and hunt them continually. Thousands of people made a living as commercial hunters, following the passenger pigeons from place to place, killing the birds and shipping them to market by rail. There were contests to shoot as many of them as possible during a given period of time. In one contest, a participant had to shoot 30,000 passenger pigeons just to be eligible for a prize. By the 1880s, millions of birds were being killed every year, and local laws were passed to try to protect them. But legal and illegal hunting wiped out the passenger pigeon. And in 1914, Martha, the last passenger pigeon, died in a zoo in Cincinnati. Illegal hunting of the passenger pigeon led directly to the nation's first wildlife protection law in 1900 called the Lacey Act, which is still today one of the most important US laws against the illegal wildlife trade. The extinction of the passenger pigeon was widely used to rally people in support of conservation. Passenger pigeons were one of many extinctions in the 20th century. The number of extinctions began to accelerate after World War II as human population and trade grew sharply. Interestingly, more than half of all extinctions in the last 150 years have been on islands. Here are three of America's most famous contributions to the world. Can you guess which one has been called America's best idea? Yeah, the answer is pretty obvious given the topic of my talk. But when speaking about American contributions to culture, jazz and jeans are usually in the mix too. Perhaps you saw this film by Ken Burns. It's an excellent history of national parks in the US. The rise of national parks and other protected areas is arguably the biggest success of modern conservation. Here's a graph that shows the rise of protected areas. Buried in the data are iconic places like Ngorongoro Crater in Tanzania, Zhou National Park in China, and Iguazu National Park on the border of Argentina and Brazil. All of these, by the way, should be on your lifetime bucket list. Perhaps you've noted that this graph is out of date. I like this graph because much of my talk today is biased towards the US, just like this graph. Look at the red circle. It shows the first protected area being established in 1872 when Yellowstone National Park was gazetted. Perhaps you have heard people say that Yellowstone is the world's first national park. That's wrong. If we use the IUCN definition of a national park as a place that protects large-scale ecological processes and provides spiritual, scientific, educational, recreational, and visitor opportunities, then in what country is the oldest national park still in operation located? Any guesses? Bagdkhan Mountain National Park, just outside of Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, was established in 1783. While this may be the oldest national park in the world still in operation, it's certainly not the oldest protected area in the world. Many of the sacred sites of indigenous people are far older than this national park. Some decide to take action. The man in this picture was one of the first to take action in the global north. This person was a Scottish American. He had a strict religious upbringing. And by the age of 11, he could recite the entire New Testament of the Bible word for word. He worked in a wagon wheel factory in Indiana, but he quit to go on a 1,000-mile walk from Kentucky to Florida. From Florida, he traveled to Cuba and then to New York and on to California, working odd jobs to sustain himself. In California's Yosemite Valley, he found his calling. He loved Yosemite. In order to stay in Yosemite more, he took a job as a local shepherd and built a cabin beside Yosemite Creek, designed so that the water flowed through a corner of the room and he could hear the water. He became a famous guide in Yosemite and wrote articles and books about Yosemite and his travels. He has been called the patron saint of 20th century American conservation. This person is John Muir, and he founded the first conservation NGO, the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club was modeled after the Appalachian Mountain Club in the eastern US and focused on establishing new protected areas. The Sierra Club helped establish Glacier and Mount Rainier National Parks and supported the establishment of the National Park Service. The first head of the National Park Service was the incomparable Stephen Mather, a Sierra Club member and arguably the greatest marketing genius in conservation history. A few years after the Sierra Club was founded, the New York Zoological Society was established, and in 1993, it changed its name to the Wildlife Conservation Society. WCS is unusual because it runs several New York zoos and the New York Botanical Garden in addition to its international conservation work. WCS, by the way, was instrumental in saving the bison in North America and sponsored the seminal study of mountain gorillas in Congo in 1959 that had a major influence on Louis Leakey and Diane Fossey. 10 years after WCS started, the National Audubon Society was founded to stop the killing of birds for plume feathers in ladies' hats. National Audubon helped save the bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, and the whooping crane. In 1936, FDR, the US president, convened a meeting of people who wanted to protect US wildlife. A new organization was born out of this meeting, the National Wildlife Federation. NWF seeks to unite sportsmen and all outdoor and wildlife enthusiasts to support the common goal of wildlife conservation. Over the last 85 years, NWF has helped the US government to pass dozens of wildlife conservation laws. On the other side of the Atlantic, conservation NGOs were also being founded. Fauna and Flora International is the world's oldest international conservation organization and the first to work in Africa. It started in 1903 as the Society for the Preservation of the Wild Fauna of the Empire. Wild Fauna of the Empire. I love this name. FFI's mission at first was to safeguard the future of Africa's large mammal populations. FFI helped to establish Kruger National Park in South Africa and Serengeti National Park in Tanzania. David Attenborough has been involved with FFI since 1959. FFI has its headquarters in Cambridge, UK. Also headquartered in Cambridge is BirdLife International, which was founded in 1922 as the International Council for Bird Preservation. Interestingly, it was two American ornithologists who founded BirdLife International. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, was created in 1948 as an offshoot of UNESCO. When UN funding to IUCN ended in the 1950s, they struggled financially. In 1961, the World Wildlife Fund was created to help fund IUCN. Yes, WWF was created to help fund IUCN. IUCN is based in Gland, Switzerland, across the road from WWF International. The same year that WWF International was created, WWF national organizations were also created in the UK and the US. Interesting fact, it was only in 1985 that WWF stopped channeling project funds through IUCN. Before we move to the next story, let's recap. We have air and water pollution, forest loss, species extinction, the growth of protected areas, and the rise of conservation NGOs. The birth of the modern environmental movement. The woman you see here graduated from Johns Hopkins University with a master's degree in zoology in 1932. A woman with a master's degree in this era was rare. She was an excellent student and planned to go on for her doctorate. Unfortunately, right after completing her master's, her father lost his job in the Great Depression. She had to find work to support her sisters and her parents. She took a job with the US government and over the next 13 years worked her way to a top position as an editor of government publications. In 1941, she published her first book called Under the Sea Wind, but it sold poorly, though the critics loved it. 11 years later, she published her second book called The Sea Around Us. This book is a biography of the ocean. It became a major bestseller and stayed on the New York Times bestsellers list for more than a year. After her second book, she had the money to quit her government job and become a full-time writer. In 1962, she published another book. This one was about the dangers of pesticides like DDT and was called Silent Spring. Silent Spring goes on to sell 6 million copies and it's translated into 30 languages. It's been called a book that changed the world. The book wakes people up to the dangers of pesticides. Pesticides were killing more than just insects. They were killing birds, and that is why we were increasingly having silent springs. What almost no one knew at the time was that when she wrote Silent Spring, she was terminally ill with breast cancer. After Silent Spring was published, the chemical companies producing pesticides attacked her, and she was called radical, disloyal, unscientific, and hysterical. The former US Secretary of Agriculture even said she's probably a communist. Her testimony in front of Congress in September 1963 was powerful and persuasive. Her professionalism and her prose in front of Congress commanded attention, even though she was in great pain from cancer. It was one of her last public appearances before she died of breast cancer. But the book and her appearance in front of Congress had far-reaching impacts. By 1975, every one of the toxic chemicals named in the book was either banned or severely restricted in the United States. Her work led to the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, and it led to the Environmental Protection Agency being founded. This woman was, of course, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson had a TNC connection. In 1956, she successfully petitioned the Nature Conservancy to open a chapter in Maine. She then chaired the chapter's board of trustees until she died. Carson was one of the first TNC Legacy Club members. At her direction, royalties from Silent Spring helped TNC protect not only the salt pond and the coast of Maine that so captured her attention, but also helped protect many of the most iconic landscapes along the coast of Maine. The growing environmental awareness in the US culminated on April 22nd, 1970, in the first Earth Day. More than 20 million people in the US turned out, and the first Earth Day remains the largest single day of protest in US history. Interestingly, the United Auto Workers helped organize and fund the first Earth Day. Since 1970, Earth Day has become a global event, and on Earth Day 2020, over 100 million people around the world observed the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. By the way, Earth Day was created by Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin, and his daughter Tia Nelson worked at the Conservancy in External Affairs for many years until 2004. Let's continue with the rise of the conservation NGOs and look at the Nature Conservancy. In 1950, the Ecologists Union changed its name to the Nature Conservancy. And on October 22nd, 1951, the new organization was incorporated in Washington, D.C. In 1955, TNC made its first land purchase, the Mianus River Gorge in New York. In 1975, one of TNC's first international projects helped establish Costa Rica's Corcovado National Park. TNC has continued to evolve over the years, just as the logos you see here have evolved as well. By the 2000s, the Nature Conservancy had become the largest conservation in the world by operating budget. Here you can see the growth in TNC's operating budget over time. Note that it was in the 1990s that the growth accelerated. By the way, TNC's operating budget today is larger than the operating budgets of WWF US, CI, WCS combined. January 28th, 1987. I hesitated to tell this story because for years it was a sensitive topic at TNC, talked about in whispers, if at all. But it's been 3 decades and we're in a new era. So here's the story as per statements and publications by Pete Seligman and Spencer Beebe, the 2 co-founders of Conservation International. On January 28th, 1987, most of the staff in TNC's international program quit. In total, 55 of the 63 international program staff, fellows, and interns left. 5 TNC board members went with them, and together they started Conservation International the next day. The split was over whether or not TNC's international program should be an independent subsidiary within TNC with its own board and donors, or whether it should remain under general TNC management. There were large philosophical differences between the Conservancy's science-based land buying managers and the international program staff, made up largely of Latin Americans seeking to empower Latin American communities to manage their own resources. International program staff saw themselves as revolutionaries in conservation. And Spencer Beebe's description of their thinking at the time reads like liberation theology's preference for the poor. At the time, a board member told Frank Boren, the TNC president, "You have a choice between a heart attack or cancer." In January 1987, the birth of Conservation International was a heart attack for TNC's international program. But a lot has changed in 34 years. Both organizations have moved towards each other over the last 3 decades, so much so that now CI is headed by a longtime TNC person, Sanjan, and TNC is headed by a longtime CI person, Jen Morris. For more on TNC history, see the book Nature's Keepers and Nat Williams' talk and slides on the history of TNC on Connect. In this history of conservation, I've focused a lot on conservation NGOs. Here's a major reason why. The conservation sector may be unique because it's primarily led by NGOs. In other sectors, NGOs are seldom, if ever, in the lead. In conservation, most investments flow through NGOs, and most conservation innovations have come from conservation NGOs. This is unlike most other sectors. Something to think about when considering why our work at TNC matters. Now let's turn to the evolution of conservation thinking. The World Parks Congress is held roughly every 10 years. One way to see the evolution of conservation thinking is in the theme at each World Parks Congress. In 1962, the theme was about expanding national parks. In 1972, it was about tourism. In 1982, it was about protecting marine, coastal, and freshwater areas. In 1992, a shift is evident. The focus is on people and protected areas. Once we start engaging more with local people, we realize the central importance of equity and benefit sharing, as we see in the 2003 World Parks Congress theme. In 2014, we realized that everything is connected, and in many developing countries, protected areas are linked to the health and well-being of people, and that respect for Indigenous people and traditional knowledge matters. The themes of the World Parks Congress are one way to see the evolution of conservation thinking. And while protected areas are hugely important, a lot of biodiversity is found outside of protected areas. By the way, I just used the word biodiversity. Did you know that this word was not even invented until 1986? 1986. It only gained prominence when E.O. Wilson used biodiversity as the title of his book in 1988. Now let's look at another way to show the evolution of conservation thinking. Think of this as the conservation tree of knowledge. New branches are formed largely due to science and learning. Some branches grow fast and some grow but then die. The trunk of the tree is state-led conservation that establishes new protected areas. Protected areas are the single biggest success of the conservation movement to date, as I mentioned previously. But many of these protected areas followed the Yellowstone model of fines, fences, and forced relocation of people living inside the protected area. The Yellowstone model remains problematic. Other branches grew that focused on private land conservation in places where private property was well protected by law. This is the land trust model that's still growing today. On the opposite side of the tree, a new branch grew to support community-based natural resource management, modeled after the Campfire Project in Zimbabwe. This branch continues to grow vigorously in the developing world. With the publication of the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment in 2005, ecosystem services came to the fore. And this branch continues to grow, though its growth has slowed appreciably in recent years outside of academia. In the 1990s and 2000s, we saw the rise of integrated conservation and development projects in the developing world. But this branch had problems and did not continue to grow. In the 1990s and 2000s, we also saw conservation organizations assessing representativeness of what's protected, and ecoregions and hotspots came to the fore. Eleanor Ostrom,'s Nobel Prize winning SES framework for managing systems where people and nature are entwined is still growing strongly and provides a cross-cutting approach that's useful in many conservation contexts. Co-management by communities and governments or an NGO continues to be an important branch in conservation thinking, especially in locally managed marine areas or LLMAs. Using private capital to invest in conservation that generates a return on investment has grown in recent years, and TNC's Nature Vest has mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars for conservation. Recently, conservation has become more attuned to inequities perpetuated by conservation initiatives, and we are taking hard looks at environmental justice. I'm sure there are more branches of the conservation tree of knowledge. This was my attempt to portray the big ideas that have shaped conservation. I'd welcome your suggestions on what to add and potentially what to prune on the conservation tree of knowledge. The Great Debate. This is a story about a debate from 120 years ago that continues to be central to conservation today. Two men each sought to shape how the American public viewed wild and natural places. We already know John Muir is a lover of Yosemite, a prolific writer, and the founder of Sierra Club. Muir had a frenemy, Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was the son of a timber magnate and the chief U.S. forester from 1898 to 1910. He too was a prolific writer. Their debate took place in articles published in magazines like Harper's Weekly, Atlantic Monthly, and National Geographic from about 1901 to 1914. Muir argued that nature should be left intact. Pinchot argued that we should use the nation's natural resources sustainably to provide the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and science should guide the management of forests and other natural resources. Muir counter-argued that it was human hubris to believe that we could successfully manage the natural world. Both wanted to protect nature, but for different reasons. Muir wanted to protect nature for its beauty and spiritual value. Pinchot wanted to protect nature for its economic value. Finding the right balance between nature for nature's sake and nature for the material benefits of people is still being debated today, as we saw a few years ago with the new conservation versus traditional conservation debates exemplified by Peter Kariva and Michael Soule. I hope you now have a better understanding of the history of conservation from a Northern NGO perspective. I hope you understand how air and water pollution, forest loss, species extinction, protected area growth, and the rise of conservation NGOs provided the foundation for public and private conservation, and how Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Earth Day awakened our environmental consciousness in the 1960s and 70s. And finally, I hope you better understand how finding the right balance between utilization and preservation of our natural world continues to be a debate in conservation today. In closing, the picture you see here is from Fitzgerald River National Park in Southwest Australia. It's one of the oldest places on Earth. The rocks in this national park have been weathering on the surface for more than 3 billion years. 3 billion years. Every plant that can grow in depleted soils of Fitzgerald River National Park is determined by the long history of this place. What's past is prologue. Everything that has happened before sets the stage for what happens next. Thank you.
Really wonderful. Why don't you come back on video, because we're going to have a little conversation and take questions. I would encourage everybody who has a question to put it in the Q&A tab below, and we'll try to get to them all. And I have to say, a lot of that history I didn't really know or didn't really put together so linearly. And so thank you for that. It's you definitely delivered on your promise to leave us with some cool conservation stories. And one of the things I was really impressed by was the fact that the conversations that were, that we were having way back with John Muir and Gifford, we're still having today. When I talk to donors and colleagues, there is this constant tension. Is it nature for nature's sake, but is it nature as natural resources? And really, we need to find a balance between what we're extracting and what we're leaving, and of course, relying on science with it all. So, I think that it really gives us a lot of food for thought. So I have a question to start us off. So as a historian, I'm curious about how you think the experience of the pandemic will impact conservation moving forward. We do know that more people are looking to nature for solace, and that started, with the pandemic. Do you think this will continue? Do you think it'll create a love of nature that will impact future conservation and our ability to get more done, or where we're doing it? And are there any historical examples we can look at for information about this?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Deb. So yeah, I'm a historian, but an amateur one. So I want to just make that clear that this is just based on my reading and being an avid student of history. Um, yeah, so we know that park visitorship in the US, particularly in some of the bigger parks, has skyrocketed. And that, I mean, I just go out to my local reservation near my house and it's never been so well used. And I hope that continues, but I'm not all that optimistic. So here's why. So back in 1918, 1919, you may recall that there was an influenza outbreak that's often called the Spanish flu, but it really almost certainly originated in the United States. It just happened to be that the Spanish government was the first to publicly talk about it. So everybody blamed, just called it the Spanish flu, even though it didn't start there. And what was really interesting was that this was a cataclysmic event for the globe. Somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died in the 1918 influenza outbreak. And then afterwards, it just disappeared. There was this collective amnesia. And there are no monuments to 100 million people potentially that died. And it's not in many history books. We know about it more now because it's been brought back up as, here's an example of what we went through, 100 years ago. But my sense is that we may be heading towards another period of collective amnesia where we just want to put this behind us. And I hope that some of those connections people made with nature, the solace that they found in nature, those remain. But I'm willing to bet in 10 years, we're trying to forget this era. And who knows, part of the roaring 20s was because people were trying to forget about World War I and the outbreak of influenza. So we might be heading into another one of those roaring periods where people are just out celebrating life.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that comes to mind just briefly is that I think China might actually stop and permanently close their wildlife markets now because of the risk of zoonotic diseases, transferring from wildlife to people. And that would be a huge benefit for global conservation because it would really reduce the wildlife trafficking. Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that could be a real meaningful takeaway as we think about the origin of this illness. And actually, if we think about things like Lyme's disease and these other these other real big problems that have a link to how we're managing the landscape and biodiversity. Maybe relying on science, maybe that'll be a good outcome, is that more and more people are thinking, yeah, we need to trust the scientists. The other thing that I think about, and I wonder what you think, as I think about the impact of the pandemic, I'm a real believer that we get a muscle memory from the experience of us as a collective making real personal sacrifices for the common good. That, over the course of the pandemic, we have all made sacrifices. We haven't had weddings or seen our children or whatever it is because we wanted to keep other people safe, and our families safe. And do you think that will make a difference in terms of people thinking about climate change and these other big issues that require personal sacrifice from all of us for us to get to the other end? Or do you think this collective amnesia is just going to wash over us? Because I think the difference after World War I, we didn't actually have a combined crisis of like the biodiversity die-off and climate change. There weren't those kinds of wildfires that are, to remind us that climate change is really here and we got to deal with it.
Yeah, you can't be in conservation for decades without being an optimist. And I am a serious optimist. So yes, I very much hope that muscle memory remains and that we're willing to tackle climate change in a meaningful way. And yeah, fingers crossed.
So we've got a few questions in the Q&A box. I remind you all, if you do have a question, do put them in at the Q&A box below. Sarah Freeman is asking about the graphic of the tree and branches, which I thought was really interesting to see it all that way. And she would like to hear more about why the conservation development branch on the left side, that little part on the left, didn't actually work out so well.
Yeah. So I still haven't decided whether I really like my tree of knowledge, because it's, but I couldn't figure out how else to put all these ideas together.
We love
If,
trees. We love trees.
if
That
anybody
tree
else
doesn't
has a
work
better way
together.
to do this, I'd love to, because it's still kind of clunky. But hey, these are often known as ICDPs, Integrated Conservation Development Projects. And they were the rage. When I was really cutting my teeth in conservation, I worked on a zillion. Everything I worked on was an integrated conservation development project. And what happened is they failed because it is not enough to give somebody an alternative to let's say the dollar they're making from conservation. They want the old dollar and the new dollar you're providing. So we were trying to do what the one critic called conservation by distraction. We were going to get local people to do something else, some alternative to the destructive or the unsustainable use of the local natural resources. And after a lot of investment by a lot of big organizations, what we found is that if you come in with a kind of a top-down plan for here's how we're going to make this community more sustainable, we're going to give you all these different alternative livelihoods, it rarely finds fertile ground. And a lot of these projects went on for a few years, and then when they stopped, the community stopped doing it. So it was not something that the community themselves had said we want. And that is that was a big shift in conservation thinking. It was much less top down and much more, let's work with local people to decide what are their priorities and how can we help them to better manage their local resources.
That's a really great observation. And to be honest, it's something that we grapple with at the Nature Conservancy in our chapters, in our state chapters, where, our goal, unlike other conservation NGOs, in Massachusetts and elsewhere, we do cool projects, but the project itself isn't the end. We're always thinking about scale. Like, what do we learn from a project that could be then scaled through policy or finance or through our global network? And the kinds of relationships with communities that make community projects really successful require a level of investment and patience that the scaling model doesn't always easily sync with. And I know we're doing some pretty innovative things right now in Massachusetts, working with communities to help communities own and vision the solution so that they're authentic and successful. And we come in and lend some technical support, right? We've got the scientific expertise. We can bring some seed money. We can help connect with state funding. But it's been a shift for us. Like, I'm pretty new to the Nature Conservancy. It's been only about 18 months, but already in my 18 months, I'm seeing how this shift in focus will be enduring. It will help us scale for the reason why, that you've described. Coming in as the experts with the solution, if it isn't, if it doesn't feel authentic, if they haven't grown those solutions, maybe it doesn't stick, more often than not. So another question from Teresa Davenport. Teresa said, you mentioned that ecosystem services and their valuation are largely an academic practice at this moment. Why do you think that this has happened? And given that social ecological systems are often studied as a suite of ecosystem services, do you think the SES model still has relevance to modern conservation practice?
So yes, the SES model, absolutely. Not only relevance, I would say it's core. People and nature are entwined, and you can't really separate. And we do to some extent in urban areas, but in a lot of rural areas where most of the biodiversity is, the local livelihoods and local well-being of people is entwined with the well-being of nature. So yeah, SES is still front and center for a lot of conservation work, a lot of just thinking about sustainability. But so on ecosystem services being more an academic pursuit now, I mean, so I've spent my whole career working internationally in conservation. Ironically, I've never worked on conservation in my home country, except for a small bit in Maine to do one study. And so it's hugely relevant. The ecosystem services approach, I think, is really a nice framework for thinking about the benefits nature provides to people. but it's not a particularly useful framework for when you're thinking about what do you need to do to conserve those services. And so it's really waned internationally. I mean, we never talk about ecosystem services in the Africa region. It's just a non-start. I mean, there's no utility in it. So I'm seeing that, we're talking with colleagues at WCS and WWF. Yeah, they're not talking about it. They're not thinking about ecosystem services kinds of approaches. So I think it's a helpful framework for understanding what kind of benefits nature provides, but it's not so useful for when you're trying to decide how you're actually going to conserve those resources or better manage those resources.
So actually, I'm going to provide a contrasting viewpoint on this.
Please. Yeah.
Because in the United States, in the work that, before I was here and at TNC, I was the secretary of Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources, and we were always talking about ecosystem services. We were making investment decisions based on ecosystem services. And in our chapters now, as we're thinking about our priorities, there's only so much money to go around. Like, what are the projects we're focusing on? What are the best investments, the best use of our dollars? We're looking for multiple ecosystem services. Like, how do we make sure that every dollar that goes in the ground is solving multiple problems? And so we think about like restoring a salt marsh in Massachusetts. We're thinking about the ecosystem services it provides for flood protection, for tidal floods, for shoreline protection, sea level rise protection. Also biodiversity, because it's where all the fish get, that whole marine system gets started in the salt marshes. And then we think about the human impact, the ecosystem service of health that people get from having access to nature. So as we're putting together a project, we're thinking about those multiple ecosystem services. And when I'm talking to the business communities, that really sells it. So I would say there may well be a disconnect right now between what's happening with ecosystem services nationally and what's here. And of course, maybe I'm looking at it in a biased way because I was part of the Gunn Institute of Ecological Economics.
Oh, okay. No, enough said. I'm a heretic then, but it's also probably because my blinders are, I just work internationally and yeah.
Well, so this is probably helpful to hear that even within TNC, we have different experiences. Yeah. So there was a great question that came in the chat. And, Devereaux Sokas noted that you mentioned the white and wealthy origins of conservation. What are your thoughts on reckoning with that past and diversifying the efforts today?
Yeah, it's critical, both of them, both looking hard at our past within the conservation movement and even within TNC, and also diversifying going forward. There are too many people that support conservation that look like me, and not enough people that don't yet know the joys of vitamin nature, just to get you outside and make that fun. There's something intrinsic about nature, and I think some people haven't yet had that joy of making that connection. But hey, let me talk for a moment then about some of the other organizations that have delved deep into their past and what they found. I kind of got fascinated with this because I got pushback early on, people saying people aren't that interested in TNC's history because of what they're afraid they're going to find. I have more than 35 different sources that I have delved deep on TNC's history. We don't have a lot to be afraid of. There is some stuff that we need to address, I think, but there's no like huge thing that's going to really hurt the organization. So any of you leaders out there that are listening to this, I think we can go deep on our history, and we're going to be better for it. Because an example of an organization that did go deep in their history is Sierra Club. And John Muir, particularly when he was quite young in his teens, he said some really hurtful things about Native Americans. But when you look at his writings, and he left a lot of writings from the time he was in his 20s to the time he died, he says a lot of very respectful things about Native Americans, and he interacted with them extensively, and he was very supportive of that. And if you want to read a great essay just defining this whole debate, Some of you may know Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote the Mars trilogy. So he wrote a very passionate article about the John Muir's history. And I think it's one of the best reasoned and best written of the articles out there. Audubon did the same thing. So Audubon's still in the middle of it, in fact. And what they found is that James Audubon, I never remember which way it goes, Audubon. But yeah, this guy, not so good. I mean, he bought and sold people like horses. One of the people on the board at Audubon resigned and wrote a really powerful article. I believe it's in the Atlantic, about the history of Audubon, and that they're fundamentally linked with a guy who was openly racist. He's out in the woods, comes across a group of fugitive slaves, and he turns them back in. And there's just a lot in that history that is pretty problematic when they're so closely linked with that one person.
So Craig, let me jump in because we don't have a lot of time. And I guess I want to add something to this. I think no matter what we find as we dig in, the history of conservation is problematic from a perspective of structural racism. And that we need to own that. Like, it's, even if our story, our individual origin story is not quite the same as Audubon, right? I think the idea of, and it comes back to that very interesting question about, that the things that you've talked about, like, is it nature for nature's sake? Is it, because as John Muir said, nature for nature's sake, he was forgetting that people lived on this land and he was kicking them off, right? That was part of these big deals were great for the big white men, but not for the people who actually lived there and have had a livelihood. So this debate about using nature and who's using nature and who's nature for is really relevant today. And I'm very excited about how TNC overall is really opening ourselves up to that conversation. Like, what does this mean for the future? And I think for us to succeed going forward as a conservation community, we have to address the structural racism piece of the origin of conservation, and that it is, we're evolving, and unless we bring in new voices, voices of people who aren't already on the table, we're not going to get it right. And we did get a question, like, would you happen, from Laura Rogers Castro, would you happen to know of any non-white individuals who played important roles in the history of conservation? Because that might be the first start. Who are the voices of people that aren't appearing here? Like, where are those voices? And I wonder, that's a good question maybe to leave us on. Are there voices out there?
So not a lot of people of color. I haven't come across those yet. But what is missing is women. So there are at least 3 women that were crucial to the history of the Nature Conservancy that are not covered in any of the standard histories of the organization, like Nature's Keepers. And yet the organization would not exist today without them. So I think there's some forgotten figures, if you guys know that movie, in TNC history that I would love to see. We're just about to celebrate our 70th anniversary in October, and I'd love to see us highlight the role of some of these key women. And let me tell you about one of them right now. So Barbara Fell was the wife of the guy who really got TNC started. What she did for TNC was help this organization to survive. So she was the one who she funded the organization almost single-handedly for the first 4 years by working as a medical technician in Washington, D.C. And she did all of the membership. She did all of the distributions. So she and her husband was sort of the figurehead, but she did almost all the work, and she funded. The organization was started with no money, $300. It was her paycheck that kept this organization going for the first 4 years until we got the Mianus River Gorge, which was our first big conservation win. And there's another story there that we would not have Mianus River Gorge without Gloria Hollister. She was the force that made that, she was the community person that made that, the preservation of Mianus River Gorge happen. She's got an amazing story that she was the right-hand person. She was a trained scientist for William Beebe. So you may know him as the guy with the bathysphere who went down to the the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and yeah. So maybe he wasn't the guy. I think it was another one, but he did some of the earliest deep dives in the ocean. And then there's a third one as well, who the only reason we think big at TNC is because of Kay Ordway. And without her challenges to the organization to stop doing these little tiny postage stamp preserves, we would not think in a big way at the organization. So there's a bunch of women that are missing from our history.
Well, that's great. And there's a couple of things in the chat, a couple of comments in the chat about the role of Native Americans Indigenous people in the United States who've really been in the lead on conservation, and folks should take a look at it. It'll be part of the recording. And obviously there's a lot more work to be done here. I apologize to a couple folks whose questions we couldn't get to, but I think this is a great conversation. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Really provocative and interesting. I know I learned a lot, and I just want to thank everybody else for joining us today. And thank you for tuning in and for your support of the Nature Conservancy. It's your support that makes all of this work possible. And we're going to be sending everyone a follow-up email over the coming days with links to the resources we talked about today and a recording of this webinar. You should feel free to share it with your friends. You can follow us also on social media at conserve_MA on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our work and to get updates on upcoming virtual opportunities to connect. As always, you can see our upcoming webinars and sign up at nature.org/MA webinars. And join us August 12th for a webinar about Bristol Bay, a natural wonder in peril. We'll hear from TNC in Alaska State Director Steve Cohen and Bristol Bay Program Director Rain Iberg. Steve and Rain will share the story behind the fight to protect a way of life and a healthy environment, build a sustainable local economy, and nurture traditions that date back millennia. They're going to give us an overview of how TNC works in Bristol Bay and what you can do to help preserve this special place, and you won't want to miss it. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon.